The damp air inside the warehouse clung to everything. The rusted iron beams, the stacks of wooden crates, the cold sweat on the back of the young enforcer's neck. It was 1935, the Bronx. 3 men stood by the heavy steel door, their hands twitching near the grips of their weapons. They were waiting for a shout, a plea, a gunshot. But from the center of the room, there was no sound at all. Just the rhythmic, deliberate snick, snick, snick of a silver blade slicing through the skin of a red apple. Sitting on a simple wooden chair, surrounded by men sent to erase him from the earth, sat Ellsworth Johnson. He wasn't looking at the guns. He wasn't looking at the exit. He was watching the apple peel spiral downward, unbroken, a perfect coil of crimson hanging in the dim light. The leader of the hit squad, a heavy-set man from Dutch Schultz's crew, took a step forward. He had orders to make this messy, to send a message to Harlem that the resistance was over. He opened his mouth to bark an order, to break the stillness that was starting to feel less like an advantage and more like a noose. But Bumpy Johnson looked up. He didn't blink. His eyes were dark, flat, and terrifyingly calm. He didn't look like a man who was trapped. He looked like a man who was bored. "You're breathing too loud," Bumpy said. His voice was a low rumble, soft as velvet, heavy as lead. The gunman froze. The sheer audacity of the comment, the total dismissal of the threat, short-circuited his brain. In that split second of hesitation, the dynamic in the room shifted. The air grew thinner. Bumpy finished the apple. He placed the knife on the crate next to him. Click. "You brought 3 men. You should have brought an army, or a priest." He stood up, slowly, deliberately. And for the first time, the hitmen noticed that the shadows in the rafters above them seemed to be moving. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of a sudden, horrific realization. They hadn't cornered a victim. They had walked into a spider's web, and the spider had just finished his dinner. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. You think you know the man because you saw the movie. You think you know him because you watched American Gangster or Godfather of Harlem. They show you the flash. They show you the fedoras, the Tommy guns, the shouting matches in the street. They give you the comic book version because the truth is too complex, too quiet, and too dangerous for a 2-hour matinee. The history books have lied to you, not by what they said, but by what they left out. The files on Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson that gathered dust in the basement of the FBI headquarters, the redacted police reports, the oral histories whispered by the old men on 125th Street, they point to a different reality. They reveal that while Hollywood was busy painting a portrait of a thug, the real man was a grand master playing 3-dimensional chess in a world of checker players. This story isn't about a gangster who shot his way to the top. It's about a philosopher who quoted Shakespeare while he ordered executions. It's about a geopolitical strategist who operated not from a war room, but from a booth at Wells Restaurant. This story will change how you understand control. It will show you that true power isn't about how loud you can scream. It's about how quiet you can make everyone else. But before he was the king who ruled from the shadows, he was a boy who was hunted in the light. To understand the monster, you have to understand the wound. Ellsworth Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, a black boy in the Jim Crow South, a dangerous place to have a brain that worked faster than everyone else's, a dangerous place to have pride, but Ellsworth had too much of both. He was born with a deformation on the back of his head, a bump, a physical flaw that gave the world an excuse to mock him. Other children were cruel. They beat him. They called him Bumpy. The name wasn't a nickname. It was a scar. It was a daily reminder that he was different, that he was considered lesser. Imagine the pressure cooking inside a child like that. The burning, white-hot shame. He didn't want to be a criminal. He wanted to be a lawyer. He devoured books. He read history, law, philosophy. He wanted to use his mind. But the world looked at him and saw a brute. The world looked at him and saw a Bumpy. So, at 10 years old, he made a decision that would haunt New York City for 40 years. If they were going to call him a monster, he would be the most terrifying monster they had ever seen. He would take that name, that insult, and he would turn it into a word that made grown men tremble in their sleep. His family sent him north to save his life, fearing a lynch mob would take him for his defiance. But when he arrived in Harlem, he didn't find safety. He found chaos. The Harlem of the 1920s was a jungle. And Bumpy didn't want to be just another animal fighting for scraps. He wanted to be the zookeeper. This is where the movies get it wrong. They show him as a brawler, but Bumpy didn't rise with his fists. He rose with his eyes. He watched. He waited. He saw that the crime in Harlem was unorganized, emotional, and sloppy. He found Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen, the woman who ran the numbers. She was under siege by the white mob, led by the rabid Dutch Schultz. Schultz was violent, unpredictable, a man who ruled by terror. He thought he could just walk into Harlem and take what he wanted because he had more guns. Bumpy knew he couldn't outgun the Italians. If he fought their war on their terms, he would die. So he changed the game. He introduced psychological warfare to the streets of Harlem. There were whispers in the night. Men who worked for Schultz would wake up to find their front doors unlocked, a single bullet placed on their kitchen table. No note, no violence, just the message, "We can get to you, anytime, anywhere." Schultz's men started to get paranoid. They started to see Bumpy Johnson in every shadow. They started to miss collections. They started to quit. Bumpy didn't fight the army. He broke the army's mind. But the tension was escalating. Schultz was losing money, and a losing gangster is a desperate gangster. He put a bounty on Bumpy's head, a massive price, dead or alive. This is where everything changed. This is the moment where a regular criminal would have run, but a legend was born. It was 1935, a hot summer night. The streets were empty because everyone knew the hit was coming. Bumpy was supposed to be in a safe house. He was supposed to be underground. Instead, he walked into the darkest bar on Lenox Avenue, alone. He wasn't wearing armor. He was wearing a tailored suit. He walked to the bar, ordered a drink, and turned his back to the door. He knew Schultz's best hitmen were tracking him. He knew they were 5 minutes away. But he also knew something they didn't. He knew the people. As the hitmen pulled up to the curb, they didn't see a helpless target. They saw a wall. The bartenders, the waiters, the patrons, the people on the street, they all stood up. They didn't have guns, they had eyes, they had presence. They formed a silent human barricade around the bar. The hitmen looked at the crowd. They looked at the silent, unwavering loyalty of an entire neighborhood, and they realized that if they fired a shot, they would never leave Harlem alive. They turned their cars around and drove away. Bumpy didn't turn around. He just finished his drink. He had proven that loyalty was stronger than lead. But the Italian mob didn't give up easily. When Schultz died, Lucky Luciano and the commission took over. These were businessmen. They were organized. They invited Bumpy to a sit-down. Hollywood shows this as a tense negotiation with shouting and threats. The reality was far more chilling. Bumpy walked into a room full of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. He was the only black man there. He was outnumbered 20-1. Luciano laid out the terms. The Italians would take over the numbers. Bumpy would be a lieutenant. He would get a salary. Bumpy listened. He sat in silence for a long time. The air in the room grew heavy. The bosses shifted in their seats. They weren't used to silence. They were used to fear. Finally, Bumpy spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke like a professor correcting a student. "Mathematics," he said softly. "It is a universal language, and your math is wrong." He leaned forward. "I don't work for you. I don't work under you. The moment you try to take Harlem without me, the numbers stop. The runners stop. The police, whom I pay double what you pay, will start making arrests. You will lose millions trying to pick up pennies." He paused, letting the weight of his threat sink in. "I am not your employee," he said. "I am the toll booth. You want to pass? You pay the toll." Luciano stared at him. He looked for the bluff. He looked for the fear. He found neither. He saw a man who was willing to burn the entire city to the ground rather than kneel. And in that moment, the rules changed forever. They shook hands, not as master and servant, but as kings of different countries. For the next 30 years, Bumpy ruled. But he didn't rule like a tyrant. He ruled like a ghost. He paid rents. He bought turkeys for Thanksgiving. He sent kids to college. He walked the streets without bodyguards, armed only with a newspaper and his reputation. He became the Robin Hood of Harlem. But don't mistake this for kindness. This was strategy. By feeding the people, he bought their silence. By saving their homes, he bought their eyes. If the FBI sent an agent to watch Bumpy, that agent would be spotted by 5 grandmothers before he even got out of his car. The phone lines would ring. Bumpy would know before the engine cooled. He insulated himself with gratitude. But as the 1960s approached, the world began to shift beneath his feet. A new threat emerged, one he couldn't bribe, one he couldn't intimidate. Heroin. The white powder was flooding the streets. The money was astronomical, but the cost was human souls. Bumpy was torn. This is the internal conflict the movies glaze over. He was a raceman. He loved his people, but he was a criminal businessman. The Italians were pushing the drugs. If Bumpy said no, they would find someone else and he would lose control. If he said yes, he would be poisoning the very people he protected. He made a choice, a dark, pragmatic choice. "If it's going to be here," he whispered to his associates, "then we control it. We keep the violence down. We keep the order." It was a lie. A lie he told himself to sleep at night, but he knew deep down that he had opened Pandora's box. And then there was Alcatraz. The movies skip this. They jump from the 30s to the 60s, but Bumpy spent a decade on the rock. He wasn't just an inmate. He was the king of Alcatraz. He commanded respect from the wildest criminals in America. He played chess with the Birdman of Alcatraz. He read philosophy in solitary confinement. He wrote poetry that would break your heart. When he returned to Harlem in 1963, he was an old man. The streets had changed. The young wolves were hungry. They didn't care about the old treaties. They didn't respect the silence. They wanted noise. And there was a new prophet in Harlem, Malcolm X. Bumpy and Malcolm, the sinner and the saint. They were friends. They had known each other from the old days on the street. When Malcolm broke from the Nation of Islam and his life was in danger, he didn't call the police. The police wouldn't help him. He called Bumpy. For weeks, Bumpy's best men stood guard around Malcolm, the gangster protecting the revolutionary. It was a secret alliance that terrified the establishment. But Malcolm was too pure. He couldn't have criminals as his guard. He sent them away. Days later, Malcolm was dead. Bumpy Johnson, the man of ice, the man who never showed weakness, cried. He blamed himself. He felt the weight of history crushing him. The world he knew was dying, and he was tired. We reach the end now, not with a shootout, not with a bang, but with a meal. July 7th, 1968, Wells Restaurant, 2 a.m. Bumpy is eating a chicken leg. He is drinking coffee. He is surrounded by friends, but he is alone in his thoughts. He is thinking about the boy from Charleston. He is thinking about the apple peel on the floor of the warehouse. He is thinking about the silence. He clutches his chest. The pain is absolute. He collapses. The restaurant goes silent. The waiters freeze. The patrons stand up. The king is dead. But here is the final quiet twist, the thing that turns a man into a legend. When the police and lawyers looked into his estate, they expected to find millions buried in vaults. They expected to find Swiss bank accounts. They found almost nothing. He hadn't hoarded the wealth. He had given it away. He had spent it on the neighborhood. He had spent it on the people. He died on the floor of a diner, not a mansion. And when news hit the street, Harlem didn't celebrate the death of a crime lord. It wept. A traffic jam of limousines and weeping mothers stretched for blocks. The funeral was fit for a head of state, because, in a way, he was. He was the head of a state that wasn't on any map. He taught us that power is not something you are given, it is something you take. He taught us that the loudest man in the room is the weakest. He taught us that if you want to win the game, you don't play by their rules, you write your own. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man who walked between the raindrops, the man who looked the devil in the eye and made him blink. His files are closed now, but the streets still remember. If you listen closely, in the quiet moments on Lenox Avenue, beneath the noise of the modern world, you can still hear the silence he left behind. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.